Okay, I've got my cup of coffee here. We are in the Gospel of Luke, right at the end there. And I want us to take a few moments because I actually really like the story. It's one of those Easter stories that somewhat gets overlooked. Now, it is a gospel story that we only find in Luke. Luke is the only one to record this, and this is the road to Emmaus. Now, I like the story for a few different reasons, which we'll expound upon here, but one of the reasons I like it is, the story starts with a couple of disciples. And then these are not the disciples that we're used to, the famous 12. And I figured this seems like a good time if you want to do some sort of brain game. I've got a quick mnemonic device for how you can remember the 12 disciples. It goes A, B, M, 4 J's, and then PST, which is PPSTT. So A, B, M, Andrew, Bartholomew, Matthew, 4 J's. James, John, James, Judas. And PST, Peter, Philip, Simon, Thaddeus, and Thomas. So Andrew, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, John, James, Judas, Peter, Philip, Simon, Thaddeus, and Thomas. When we eventually can get together again and go to parties, you can just wow people with your knowledge of the ability to bring the 12 disciples of Jesus to your mind like that. You're welcome. So I like this one because it does talk about these disciples, but we find out the name of one of them is Cleopas. So he's not necessarily of the 12, and that just goes to show that there's still a lot about the Jesus story that has been lost to the common memory, common imagination of people. And the story is great because we have these two disciples. They're leaving Jerusalem. This is after everything's taken place, and they are disheartened. They're not hiding like the other 12, but they are leaving. They're getting out of Dodge. They're heading back, obviously, towards the village known as Emmaus. So as they're walking along the road, obviously during daytime, you got to think about in the distance, you can maybe still hear like them pulling down the cross, like that grinding, squeaking sound of nails coming out of wood. And just think about like the silence that they're feeling, or they're talking and wrestling with stuff. But as this is going on, they're joined by another traveler. Pretty common. Safety in numbers, especially at that time. This person doesn't look armed, comes in, asks politely if he can join them. And then after a little while of traveling, he asks them, they do seem very down. There's obviously a vibe. Ooh, it's a very loud vehicle. There's obviously a vibe between the two of them. And so he starts to ask them some innocent questions. What's going on? How's your day going? And they launch into this great, and I think still very applicable, not tirade, but series of complaints and laments. We're here because we really thought Jesus of Nazareth was the person that we've been waiting for, the long-awaited Messiah. And Jesus, playing dumb a little bit, just sort of asked them, who are you talking about? And they're like, you must be the only person on planet Earth who hasn't, they wouldn't have said planet Earth, who doesn't know what's going on. Don't you know what just happened in Jerusalem just now? And they sort of expound upon their understandings of who they believe Jesus was and their understandings of what the Messiah was. And as Jesus listens to them and asks a couple questions, he comes to this place and he says, quote, "How foolish you are! How slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken! Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And Luke goes on to write, "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself." How foolish you are, how slow to believe. Well, these are not words we care to hear from Jesus. They're words that we need to remember, especially in this Easter season. He looks at them and says, because obviously they're talking back and forth, they're sharing their understandings. So these are people who know. This is not just sort of off the top of their head. These are a couple of disciples, never forget that, who have invested some serious time thinking about this stuff. And then when it all played out, they lose their faith immediately. And again, while not in hiding, they are running. And Jesus says, listen, this is what was always supposed to happen. You thought about this. How did you miss this integral part? And he starts with Moses, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, arguably the heart and definitely the origin stories of the Jewish faith. Walks them through the prophets and all these prophecies, all these sort of coded, mysterious language of what had to take place as God gives us little foreshadowing ideas of how amazing this story is going to be, and has done that through generations. The Moses and the Prophet, two collections of writings that these disciples would have been very, very familiar with, and especially if they were disciples of Jesus, they would have been very familiar with the way he was playing with the old meanings and the old interpretations and showing them a new revelation in light of himself. He says this was always supposed to happen. And he walks with them and he teaches them and he guides them. And they're just like Jesus, they are enraptured and they sit there and they listen. I want to echo that statement, maybe not saying how foolish, but again, how slow are we to believe? I can't stress this enough. What we're going through right now, this COVID-19 thing, this is the normal flow of human life. It's the past 100 years in the West of peace and health and stability. That's truly, from a global history of humanity, that's truly the anomaly. That is the blip. We are coming back to a way of living that almost all of our ancestors and brothers and sisters this was life. This is just an absolute part of life. And so I want us to remember the fact that when Jesus talks to his disciples, when Paul and Peter write in the New Testament, they frequently and without apology and almost casually just reference there's going to be wars. There's going to be rumors of wars. Nations are going to fight nations. There's going to be earthquakes and natural disasters. This is how things go out. Paul is about the most articulate in the hope he offers. And I've said this to you before. He's like, just look to a woman giving birth. The labor pains are real and suffering, and any human being would not choose to go through that. And as the old joke goes, if men had to give birth, families would never have more than one child. I think that is true, at least from my own experience. But his point is, he's like, that labor gives birth and creates life. And once that's done, a mother will gladly have taken on that pain in order to create and have that life and that child. He's like, it's a very similar thing. Understand that it is the labor pains of the cosmos as it's giving birth to the redemption that God has planned. So Jesus walks with them and he talks with them. He shows them that the crucifixion, that all their dashed hopes and dreams are not the end of their faith, but the end of their illusions, of what they believe God was doing for them, about what they believe who Jesus was. And I mean, brothers and sisters, my family, myself included, not much has changed in the 2,000 years of telling these stories. We still have these ideas built up of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Throughout times of plague and pestilence and famine, many people said, well, because you're a follower of Jesus, we should be, he's the great physician. We'll be healed. We'll be immune. But the wise among us said, whether or not we're taken by this disease or this war or whatever's going on is not the point. For us to die is to gain. We enter into the kingdom of God and all of our problems cease. And in that way, we're rewarded. We can lament those whom we love and they go and we cry and we're fully free to do that sort of stuff. But brothers and sisters, while we're here, let us act out our faith. Let us be little Christs. Let us be people of peace that offer hope and consolation to those who may not share that same level of faith and may actually be freaking out. Elle and I were talking just this weekend about the tragedy that people are going through. And I mean, you'll see in the prayer list, there's a little Eli. For those of you at Westover, you're a bit more familiar, but Eli has been wrestling with a potentially terminal disease for many years and just a little guy and super cute. But if you click on that link and see the newspaper article of a little boy in Hamilton that knows Eli, and I mean, get ready to cry. I think I was about two sentences in, excuse me, it's happening. And you see the real suffering and the real pain. And Ellen and I were talking back and forth. And she made this great comment. She's like, I don't understand how people cope with stuff like this if they don't have faith. They don't have God to lean on. And I agree. And so Jesus, again, as he will continue to do through his Spirit, explained to us that as bad as things look out here, that is the point of faith, is believing in all these prophecies from the Old Testament and the New Testament, that things were always going to go sideways, that is not something you escape from when you become a believer, that Jesus' death and resurrection doesn't mean that this world just stops being crummy or stops being scary or even stops experiencing death. The point is, we now recognize that this is actually just a part of a process which is bringing about life. And that is not something you're ever going to get up here. And that is the other point of the story. And that's the point of the story I want to end with right now, is they listen, they are convicted, and then they end up and they stop in this little house. The sun's going down, it's getting dangerous, you need to take some shelter. And it's when they break bread that their eyes are opened, and they see that this teacher on the road with them is none other than the resurrected Jesus himself. Again, very large car. I'm hoping people are having fun driving out there. And just like that, he's gone. It's the importance of eating. I mean, I've heard this reflected upon. I've done this myself, and the intimacy that a shared meal has, and that's all true, and that's all absolutely accurate. It's why I think I love this story as we head into next week when we do communion. But the point I'm trying to make as Jesus breaks the bread is they have an actual mystical eye-opening experience. And I will tell you this, brothers and sisters, we can wrestle with this stuff day in, day out for years, for the rest of our lives. And if we come at this thing purely from a logical point of view, I'm afraid to say that chances are we're going to miss it. We can read and know all the words and all the teachings and all that sort of stuff and still be very capable of missing it. That is because the human mind can only do so much. And believe me, as someone who's wrestled with this stuff for many, many years, it can only do so much. Really, in order to be a child of God, to be a person of faith, it's just that. It is faith. It is a mystical experience, as uncomfortable as that sounds. As much as that sounds like some form of intellectual suicide, that is not what I'm saying. But it's when the Spirit shows up that then faith just becomes the next step. And Cleopas and the other disciples say, hey, now that they've seen Jesus, like, remember when he was talking, how much it, like, our blood boiled and he really, like, resonated with us? All of a sudden, everything he'd been talking about makes sense. But it only makes sense in light of the fact that they had just seen the resurrected Jesus. That is what Christianity actually is about. Some form, some encounter with the Spirit of the resurrected Christ dwelling within you, which makes it possible to look at the world around us, to look at the scriptures and find some sort of connection, and most importantly, to see God. That is what this Easter season is about. We are still on some form of road to Emmaus, still struggling with our doubts and our illusions and our feelings of disappointment and fear that Jesus has not been what we believe Jesus was to be, that God has not done for us what we believe God should do. And to you, I say this, remember the Emmaus story. They were right. It's completely understandable. I understand what they were doing. They were trying to figure this out. And when Jesus himself came along and explained it to them, they still couldn't quite get there. But when he broke bread, when he entered into a space of intimacy and shared relation with them, then their eyes were open. Not because of his arguments, not because of his logic, not because of his ability to explain the Bible to them, but just because of who he is. And that's why the Christian faith can work for the scholars and the academics, and for the absolutely most simple person, because it's not about whether or not we can form the right words. It's about our experience and the fact that Christ chooses, because of love, to dwell within us. And that is how our eyes can be opened. That is how our minds can all of a sudden take an argument that for who knows how many years just didn't add up and say, oh, not because suddenly we figured it out, but because the argument kind of pales in comparison to the reality of the resurrected Jesus. So as we do communion next week, and we'll reflect on this further, it is about that sacred, mystical act of drinking wine and eating bread that are so much more than wine and bread, even as they remain just wine and bread. This is the life of faith. And I hate to say this to you, and this is really hard for me to struggle with as well, but it's not always supposed to make sense. So let us not be slow to believe, even if we are slow to figure things out. Let us believe that despite everything that's going on, you are known by God, you are loved by God, and even something as scary as death for us, in the words of Paul, is to gain Christ, and therefore to have everything we need. I love you. I miss you. I can't wait for us to be together again, but as we all walk our various Emmaus roads, never forget that Jesus walks with us. God bless you.